Once again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues. We are beginning this plenary discussion, which is dedicated to the sustainable growth in Russia. Today, we are running a slightly different format from what we used to have in the previous years. We're going to have one big presentation by Alexey, Kudrin. And the second difference from previous years is that we're going to have several questions to the audience. And so we'd like all of the colleagues who are seated here with us and who are going to listen to the presentation by Alexey, Kudrin, and our other guests to participate in our work. There will be several sociological questions polled to the room, and your answers are going to be commented by the speakers and panelists. So, with this regard, I'm going to raise my first questions now, and the remotes are all in your hands, and you will then have to press the number button, which you believe is the proper one in terms of referring to the question. Our first question to the room, and the first option for an answer. What kind of challenge for Russia in 2018-2014 you believe to be the most important one? And you have to identify one answer of the following ones. Demographic one, reduction of the youth through growth of the demographic burden. Second, technological lagging behind. Then the isolation from the external market. The fourth, inefficiency of public administration. And the fifth, the alienation of the business environment from the private initiative. The room is going to vote, and then Alexey Kudrin will see the results and he will comment on them. So please, come on the stage. Dear friends, thank you for joining this session, Friday the 13th. But I believe that we have something to respond with to the challenges that our country is facing, even despite this kind of day in our debate. First of all, of course, the old model of this country's economy today is quite evidently is not working, and this is something that we've been talking a lot about during the past few years, but it hasn't yet launched itself within the new model. Decisive measures are not being undertaken which would enable one to create and launch the new economic model. We are facing very serious challenges which objectively curb our economic growth, and these steps which the country and the government and the president ought to undertake are not ordinary. They are quite serious. In the first place, these are demographic challenges, insufficient investments, including the problem of sanctions and us distancing ourselves from the global market, technological lagging behind, low productivity, low quality of the public administration. I didn't name all the challenges. You've just voted, and we will take a look at the results of this voting in the course of my presentation. But in the first place, I would like to talk about the historic period that we're living through from the point of view of economic growth. Generally speaking, looking back at the 1970s, the period of stagnation without taking into account the first few years of the 90s, when the economy was in a collapse after the central economy disintegrated as well as the USSR broke down, we're currently staying at quite a very low historic rates of economic growth, which is even lower than if compared during the Soviet period. We ended up being in the very long track of low rates, which is not only related to the oil price decline or the sanctions which are aimed at this country. We must say that the basic issues are within Russia, and the basic issues are institutional and structural problems which have accumulated themselves up till now. The leadership is setting us the task, and we do understand that this country has to live with a kind of economic pace which should be higher than the average global one in order to retain the share of our economy in the global system. And achieving these rates is not easy, because this was the task which we used to have 5 and 7 years ago, but so far it hasn't been done. In this particular case, I'm quoting our outlook for possible economic growth rates in case systemic, institutional, and structural reforms are undertaken, which by 2019, which enable one to achieve the level of more than 3%, and by 2022, in excess of 4% growth. Of course, these are outlook things. Something can be done sooner, and certain other things may have to be done later. The integrational scenario, which you see here below the basic target one, is given by the Minister of Economic Development, was given 6 months ago, and it is based upon lower rates of growth which could be achieved against the factors which are currently seen in the market. So how one can transit from one inertia kind of a trajectory towards the one which has higher pace of growth, and certainly I will also say that within the basic target scenario by 2035 we would have been able to achieve GDP, to grow our GDP almost twice within the inertia kind of trajectory, only 1.5 times. And although I believe that even in this particular inertia kind of case, I believe it is less realistic in as far as not holding certain reforms sooner may face challenges of global markets and the reduction of our presence in them, including the hydrocarbons, because the world is about to very actively resort and rebuild its energy systems, its resource sources, and even within this inertia scenario, won't be able to do well. So one should move more daringly, undertaking reforms and responding to the global challenges. Now, speaking about the key factors, certainly such factors are the state of labor, capital and investments, and the productivity of the economy. And in this particular case, the demographic trend, the inertia one, according to Russian Statistical Agency outlook, shows that we have switched over to a trend of continuous reduction of the number of population which are actively employed. The country which is going down the declining trend in terms of the number of the actively employed people, this kind of country would find it very difficult to begin economic growth. So the agency's outlook is based on the premise of raising the retirement age and involving into the numbers of actively employed those who are about to retire these days. So in our option, we suggest that the retirement age for women up to 63 years, for men up to 66, but this is just an estimate because undoubtedly the decisions themselves are going to be made through a respective due process and would be taken into account more seriously in terms of preferences to specific social groups. But this challenge also means that throughout this period, by 2030, we will witness the reduction of the youngest generation amongst the ably employed by 3 million, and the senior generation will grow in numbers by 3 million. So within 60 years, there is a resource, labor resource available which can be brought into active employment. So these are the challenges that we have to encounter, which means that this particular factor is very limited. And even this particular forecast is based upon taking into account the inertia scenario in the area of inflow of migrants, and consequently it is very difficult for us to be able to gain additional labor resource. The next driver, the next factor, investments in capital. In percentage ratio to GDP, during some years, we had more than 21% of GDP in terms of investments. So currently we are at a very low point, but against the backdrop of sanctions remaining, which we do account for in our outlook, we anticipate that proper institutional reforms would lead to an accumulation of various opportunities and possibilities of using investments into resources. So we'll be relying upon internal domestic investments, and the key factor here is low inflation and the low cost of money and access to investment resources from our enterprises. And this is something that we will also mention later. But to step out the framework of this particular outlook in investments is very difficult in the current environment. I would say that this is quite an ambitious plan. Now, if we take as a basis these two factors, labor and capital, one should try and look where is our productivity, what is going on with it. And I will later speak about it, but right now I would simply add that in our disposal, the foundations and funds which, as a rule, in different economies serve as the source of long-term money, are not very sizable yet. And I would like to draw your attention that the non-banking sector assets such as the insurance and mutual funds in many mature economies exceed 100%, sometimes 200% of the GDP. Even in some of the countries which are very close to us in terms of conditions, China and India, it's in excess of 20–25%. In our case, in this country, these sources are very limited. And here, there are two sides to it. On the one hand, we don't have them yet. On the other hand, by accumulating them, we'll be able to create a new reserve for investments. In this way, we need to be very attentive towards the cumulative elements, voluntary and mandatory ones, which serve as the sources of this kind and incentivize this particular process. It doesn't switch over. Now then, in our target scenario, one of the sources for growth should be exports. Low rates of demand, which within the next few years are going to remain, won't allow us to grow our productivity and services, which would be consumed domestically. So we need to take up more active position in the external market and change the share of non-resource and energy products in order for it to exceed 50%. Within the next 15 years, I think that this is the kind of task which we are capable of doing, but with a more active policy making and administration, and with domestically and with the support of businessmen. Now, what's with productivity? The productivity rate of growth in the middle of zeros reached high indicators, historically high compared to even the countries which were able to achieve economic wonder. 4% is the best period of industrialization and modernization, both in the case of China and Germany. However, right now, we are going through a stable decline. The capital gains growth and even investments in 2006 and 2008 essentially meant the trend for productivity fall, which currently reached minimum figures. Henceforth, this side of all of these factors is the narrowest one, seemingly the most manageable one. I mean, this is our policy, these are our measures, institutional structures in the first place. But on the other hand, it is specifically right now that the productivity shows that in this particular case, the current policy is not effective. I would like to really count by the fingers of my palms where the productivity comes from. Innovation, organizational efficiency, institutional improvement, incentivization, socio-cultural, entrepreneurial, the readiness to accept risk, human capital, and the state of labor efficiency, and the administrative costs, transactional costs, and others. So applying all of these factors for transformation may allow one to improve productivity. So what is it that we need to achieve the rates that I'm talking about? We need to raise the aggregate factor of productivity within the next few years by as a minimum 1% of annual growth, and subsequently up to 2 and 2.4% in order to achieve the kind of the target outlook that I've referred to. Now, to what extent it is difficult to do? Where are we in terms of our whereabouts compared to the world? If we take a look at different industries and measure these compounded productivity factors there, then by taking as the raw example, 100% in certain countries, let's say financial and business services, United States, for example, logistics, France, IT solutions to a certain extent. Sweden is in the lead these days. And so by measuring our position with respect to the compounded productivity within these sectors, we'll be able to see that we are sometimes lagging behind multiple times, sometimes dozens of times from these leading countries. Don't confuse it with the labor productivity, which sometimes we are better off. But if you take a look at all of the factors which exist in a given economy, in a given country, in terms of the conjunction and convergence of these factors and the quality of all of the institutional work, then we're very much behind. So in order to pass through this period, even achieving the current leading state in the world within the next 10 to 15 years, we need to do a lot. And by going back to this slide, I would like to draw your attention to the top caption. From 2000 to 2004, we were able to grow our compounded productivity by 52%, and within the years till 2034, we need to pass almost the same kind of result, but against the low oil prices, respectively, and the kind of challenges that I've previously enumerated from the point of view of labor, capital, and the global challenges that we are facing these days. So, respectively, I will give you an example in order just to be able to size ourselves up in terms of how far we are behind. The quality of the multifunctional robots per 10,000 employees, which are currently on an annual basis are being bought and installed. In South Korea, 478. In China, 300. In China, 36. In Russia, 2. That's where we are. I'm just giving you one illustration, and I can run a whole list of them. Russia is aware of these tasks, is it not? Yes, it is. And in our planned documents, there are tasks like that in order to raise the spending on R&D and improve innovations. We set ourselves targets in the long-term development concept, 3% of the GDP, but today we haven't moved on. The share of industrial enterprises involved in technological innovations was supposed to rise up to 45, 50, but there's no movement. The share of innovative products should have been rising up to 35, 32%, but even here, we haven't been able to move much forward. So what happens is we're setting ourselves targets, but we're not moving towards them. Why is this happening? Why this country's management machine and the system always, kind of running idle? When I began my work over the strategy, I was told, well, I'm sure that you're writing a good strategy, so it will be good if at least 50% of it is going to be done. If 50% of it is done, and, if it is satisfactorily met by everybody, we won't be able to achieve the kind of results that I've mentioned these days. Why are we behind in technology? Of course, in technology there are more risks than in an ordinary business, because we're saying that in our ordinary business there are so many risks, but in technological entrepreneurial work there are even more risks. A short planning horizon, time frame for planning, because of a number of circumstances, including the state of the financial market, which we used to have before, the regulation of the economic activities, our supervisory and legislative control, our law enforcement are exerting excessive pressure upon businesses. Even the kind of steps which the government is undertaking by creating a foundation of innovative development and support is very selective and not always works properly. As the result, we are currently facing the problem of technological dragging behind the world, Russia behind the world. And I believe this is the most serious challenge that the country is facing within the next 10 to 15 years, which means a contraction of our economic potential and the decline of the well-being, because we are going to lose markets. We're not going to participate in the currently forming new markets. And out of the first top 10 most capitalized companies in the world, during the past 10 years, it changed completely. All of the oil companies left, just one left. All the banks left, just one bank left, stayed in it. So information and IT and technological companies entered this 10 top list. And pharma, the ones who are involved in modern technologies. So we have a problem of the reduction of the defense potential and threat to the sovereignty of this country if we don't become a technological nation. And I should say that even our military experts in our group are saying that technological challenges that Russia is facing are much stronger than geopolitical and military ones. So this is where we've got to shift this main focus of our interest. And the loss of a historic perspective in terms of being able to go back into the group of global leaders within the strategic programs of respective countries, which recently have been adopted: Industry 4.0, Germany, China, Finland, UK, Singapore. During the past 3-4 years, all of them have adopted a program of technological breakthroughs. And if we don't correspond to these challenges, then these programs, by the way, are saying that most probably many countries such as the United States, Germany, and others will really leave most of the countries far behind in their technological breakthroughs, and some of the countries, amongst which unfortunately Russia is also quoted, may technologically fall behind for eternity, because the scale and the dynamics of the new technological development today is such that one must not stand still today. So respectively, we must grow in our awareness of this being the most important challenge to this country, which we ought to respond to. And so, moving over to this about how one should respond, I would like to possibly come to one preliminary conclusion: the state of the institutions of government and public administration, the state of public institutions, the state of entrepreneurial environment, readiness to accept risk and to go into investments currently is at the kind of level which doesn't enable to resolve the tasks that I am talking about, i.e. that we've got to tune ourselves up to the kind of reforms which would enable us to move over to the new quality of the way these is to be resolved. What should we start with? We are very much government-centric economy. In many ways, we start with the government, because the government is over everything just yet. So we need to begin this reform with the government. And in the first place, the reform of the public administration, because in the first place, we need to have a modern change management system, because the world is changing and we need to be able to change as fast. We cannot review certain proposals how to improve the work we do, be it in the executive or legislative bodies, for months, for years. This must be shortened down to months, weeks, or hours. And I didn't say by area. Months and hours and weeks. And the kind of changes that we need to institute in our system and further improve this system must take place much faster, dozens of times faster. The HR reform, we've got big problems with recruiting new employees and their competence, because incompetent staff, which doesn't possess the current technology, respectively, cannot make the kind of decisions that we need. So training, professional development, respective procedures, recruitment must be raised to a new level, even in the public administration. Optimization of processes. As we often say, we need to split what we do into processes, the current permanent ones, and the kind of changes that we need to have today. The government project office is the first step, but I would say that this accounts for just 10% of what has been done to transit towards change management, because this is yet a very shy step, and this is just one of the projects that was identified. It's just a miserish amount of what really needs to be done in this whole realm of change. So respectively, we ought to be able to manage change and optimize the processes that currently we are working with. And finally, an approach to a new task, creating a government as a platform of accelerated digitalization of all of the processes, and an introduction of new management models which already exist. And a number of countries already have started it. What I'm saying, I'm not just trying to take it out of the blue. I'm not trying to suggest something that is not known. Some of the countries already began this, and we ought to begin together rather than just wait for the next 5-10 years for us to first see the results and not be able to catch up. So in the first place, we need to build government services on the basis of the developing IT technologies, outsourcing of services, public services, and I could run the list further down because these involve substantial technological solutions. For example, integration of government data. We've got 390 information systems that the government is using. We spent hundreds of billions on this during the past few years, but we are far from having an efficient data exchange system even between the government agencies. So I'm not going to enumerate all of the points, but this feedback and fast change management are very important. Big data. Well, currently we're saying, the supervision by the government, for example, you have an auditor coming, so the whole operation has to stop. We even have some of the reviews and surveys which say that if auditors, government inspectors come to a company, it means that this company will demonstrate lower results within this year. But then another year will have to be spent to respond to the claims as a result of this audit. So moving over to big data and to the kind of analysis that the government can do without entering the workplace should be the most important task. The prevention, warning a company that it is on the brink of the problems must become the basic activity done by the supervisory government authorities. So respectively, we need to create a new qualitative system of the way the government interacts with the businesses. And I will move over to the next topic, which is the key one. Even if we are falling short of the quality of work done by the public administration and the law enforcement being excessive somewhere in terms of working with the business. Even sometimes businesses cannot come to terms and between themselves. There's got to be a link which would be pursuing a very honest and straightforward arbitration so that we know where to go in order to resolve all these problems without bribes, without any pressure upon the judiciary. So the reform of the judicial system is the most important one. We need new laws, but the most importantly, recruiting new people and creating the system of independence of judges and a whole number of steps which professional community today is ready to support. And we are going on and moving forward in this dialogue. The most important is to liberate private initiative and to bring up this entrepreneurial spirit. So the reduction of the government involvement here is quite tangible, but it cannot happen overnight because you need to very well think through all that has to be done, but in the course of not such a lengthy time, maybe 6, 8, 10 years, but in a stable way. Every year you can improve things. Administrative infrastructural monopolies, very often they are artificial, so we need to deregulate certain areas to allow private companies to enter into it and to do more active work. I won't go further. And the quality of the corporate governance in the government-run companies, it is very formal and it doesn't lead to a real efficiency in the work these companies do, even wherever they remain. New competitive sectoral policy and a whole number of proposals we are ready to voice. And as well as the development of the medium and small businesses and entrepreneurship in the first place in the technological sector, then exposing human potential. One must raise the level of funding for such sectors already by 2024, at least by 0.5% of the GDP. Approximately every year. This is the minimum that we ought to do in order to begin transformation in this area as well. And when I was saying that the government must become a technological entity, it must today begin with itself, because the public administration should be modernized and raised up to a new technological basis. Healthcare, education, logistical, infrastructural work, whatever is related to the government must be the first one to be transformed, because we need to create this demand for the market and demonstrate the expertise and become the raw example in such transformations. So respectively, introducing new technologies of remote healthcare monitoring, as well as diagnostical work, as well as training and education, and other technical solutions in these areas within the next few years should become our target and task. So if we say that we will need to rely upon the adult population because we will have fewer younger generation representative in the actively employed, we need to create continuous education, because for the new tasks, because some of the professions are going to disappear, new ones will come, we need to create this continuous education for any generation, including the senior citizens. We don't have such a system in place in Russia these days, and something that will have something to spend on it. Then literacy 2021, and the new competencies then the ability to improve the importance of the occupational training in the area of healthcare, like I used to say, this is healthy way of life, monitoring, prevention. This is medical checkups like they used to be in the old days, but based on the new technologies. I'm not going to certainly enumerate some of the tasks which in the area of healthcare we are facing, but without a human being, when he is 60, to be able to feel himself like he used to be back in the 50s, that won't happen because the world already has gone further down that road. So we need to create the quality of life for the senior citizens, and in this way resolve the issue of active longevity. So this is what we need to do.
So, flexibility of labor market and limitation of labor resources. You know what problem we have? The old jobs are being reduced quicker than creating new ones. We are lagging behind. We are still sticking to the old system, to having the older labor market, but we understand that we need to give a greater mobility to the labor market. We need more active labor markets, more flexible, where we are creating some new trade zones. We need to bring personnel. Personnel should be more mobile. Otherwise, we will not be able to accumulate enough labor in the growth areas. We are now bringing from Europe even some welders, which is not the way it should be. And of course, retraining, training of migrants, that's very important. Development of the cities, because the cities are centers of technology development. The cities is where we have intellectual, social resources. Social capital is a very important factor of development, and we need to ensure new opportunities to the big cities. We only have 2 cities in Russia that can compete with the leading global capitals in main factories, because in our country, young people think that only if they move to Moscow or to St. Petersburg, they would be able to live a modern life. And we would need to create in Russia 10 or 15 big agglomerates or big cities that would be competitive with the big Asian, European or American cities. We need today not only to support regions, we need to support centers that would become the centers of new opportunities. And of course, we need to change our attitude to rural areas. Rural areas should not be only involved in agriculture, because they need diversification of their economy. We need to focus on creation of better transport infrastructure and creative industry in the cities. I mean, design, programming, and whatever. That's also what we need to focus on, because this is 1 or 1.5% of GDP. In big cities, it's 6 to 8% of GDP of a large city. And this helps to create new design in everything. In iPhone, like Steve Jobs said once, the iPhone is 30% of creation of mathematicians and engineers, and the rest is the result of designers and other creative specialties jobs work. And that's why today we need creative industry that will transform our industry and services. Of course, I also was speaking about the technological development, and the state should be a role model in this, and we need to favor the development of technological entrepreneurship, leading universities as innovations reservoirs should be further development, and this will favor creating new opportunities in different cities. We need to create new products, and the state would play a great role in this at the very beginning. And then you probably remember the saying that in Russia you can order one product and it would be produced in a very good quality, but you cannot place an order for a series. Even though we invest in R&D, in patent activities, we are still not good enough in organizing the production of series. I said we have to keep inflation below 4%. Today, our task is 4%, but we need to keep it lower than 2%. In future, in this way, we will be able to create long money and be more efficient. And considering that I don't have much time left for my speech, let me say that talking about the budget system of our country, from 2007 and 8, just look for social policy. The expenses were increased by 4% of GDP. Now the defense industry increased its expenses and now is lowering its expenses. And only these two types of expenses have increased over the past years. And when I was talking about our system, I knew that every year we have to deviate quite a lot of financial resources to keep the pensions in the country at a decent level. When we are talking about the extension of the pension age, we are first of all thinking of how to preserve a decent pension. Over the past 7 years, for instance, the budget, the healthcare, the education system either stagnated or we see that even some expenses in these areas are declining. This is not how we are going to develop further our economy. And there is another challenge, the lower blue area. This is the forecast of budget income up to 2035. And the budget income is going to decline even if we have a good growth rate. Even like this, we understand that the oil and gas sector, which usually generates more taxes, considering the situation in this industry, this tax will be declining in the budget, plus in the Far East, for instance, there'll be additional tax benefits because there are higher costs. And in 2020, in 2021, we will have a big transformation coming because the income into our state budget will decline. Are we ready to go down to 32 or 30%? Or like now, it's about 37% of GDP that goes on different expenses. Will we be able to shrink our expenses and at the same time solve the current problems? I'm not saying that today I'm ready to make a final decision. We have a choice to make. And at the same time, I mean, we need to look for other sources of income, possibly by transforming our tax system. 32% of total GDP expenses, if this goes for solving the problems we have, or 34%, that's the question we have to decide on. That's what we are working on now. And all the most important resources for this is trust. Trust in the president, trust in the authorities, in the parliament, in ministries, in police. It's lower, 35, 20 or 15%. If the population has very low trust in the main and the main authorities, that's not real good. And when you ask the citizens whether they trust other citizens, they don't know, probably. You know, in our country, usually the respondents say that they don't trust other people. 67%, which is very high. And when we ask whether they trust the people they know and they communicate with, yes, about 70% say they do. So we need to increase trust in the authorities in what they are doing. Without this, any transformation is not easy to do. And of course, we have to reform the state structure. We have to promote private initiative. We need to enhance the technological development as one of our priorities for the coming 15 years. Open integration into the global economy. Our foreign policy should be focused on favoring technological development and trust, enhancing trust as one of the main drivers of development. Thank you. I got the results of our poll, opinion poll. Can we see that on the screen, or should I read it out? The answers regarding the challenges you think the most critical ones. Demographic, 12.12. Technological backlog, 26. Distanciation from external or foreign markets, 19.9, and inefficient state administration possibly is considered as the main challenge because it collected most points. And of course, technologically being behind the others, that's another challenge we have to think about. And we need to agree jointly on how to face these technological challenges. Thank you. Dear colleagues, please come and take your seats in the panel for us to start our discussion. Dear colleagues, let me introduce to you the participants of our discussion who are going to comment the speech. This is the chairman of the Chamber of Audits, Tatyana Golikova, Mr. Siluanov, Minister of Finance, Ksenia Yudaeva, Deputy Chairman of the Central Bank of Russia, Maksim Oreshkin, Minister of Economic Development, Mr. Muller, EPA Vice President of the World Bank, and Andrei Klepach, Deputy Chairman of Vnesheconombank. So, let's start our discussion. If we remember the presentation by Alexey Kudrin, I would divide it into two parts. Number one is economic policy measures it suggests, and number two, the reform of social and public institutions, which seems to be more complex and longer to implement. Because when you reform the institutes, you can either imitate reforms or be stuck in this reform. So you have to prioritize because you cannot implement all reforms at the same time. So First question to the audience was about the challenges. The majority considers that the public administration needs reform, first of all, and I guess we can agree with this. But the priorities in reforms, which reforms should be top priority? Please, colleagues in the audience, could you please answer the question, in which area do you consider the reforms to be top priority? Number one, monetary policy. Number two, monitoring and oversight, public administration, foreign policy, social sphere. Number six, legislation and judiciary system. Number seven. While you are voting, let's start our panel discussion. In the context of long-term sustainable economic development, macroeconomic stability seems to be very important to achieve. Low inflation in this context is one of the components of such a stability. And we know that there is no quick growth in case of high inflation. We want to keep our inflation at about 4%, and the majority of experts agree with this. But what next? Low inflation is also no good, as the experience of other countries shows, because you can get into the liquidity trap when the economic policy, I mean monetary policy, does not influence the behavior of economic agents and does not influence the economy. Or on the other hand, it can drive up the real interest rate. Tell me, please, what will happen next after we reach these 4% of inflation? Thank you very much for your question. I'm very glad that lowering inflation and keeping it at a low level is considered as a structural reform, because it is a structural reform. We need low inflation to create the necessary ground for reforming our economy, making it more diversified. What will happen next? Before I talk about some long-term prospects, let me first talk about the near future in terms of transformation of our policy. In the markets, there is quite a good certainty, and our forecasts are saying that 4% by the end of this year is quite an achievable level of inflation, and in the coming few years we want to keep it as low as 4%. What does that mean? In economy, there are lots of unpredictable factors, variations, fluctuations, and this means that the target figure can be either lower or higher. And the policy of the Central Bank of Russia would be to bring the inflation back to 4% in case of any fluctuation. And we will fine-tune our policy depending on this analysis. And at the same time, don't forget that fluctuation can be due to change in demand or change in supply. When there is a change or a shock in demand, which changes the inflation, then the stabilization measures are similar to the measures that are taken to increase the economic efficiency, and the stability of inflation expectations is another factor we are talking about. While if there is any shock in terms of supply, like if the oil prices change very much, then we need a different set of measures. While to increase the economic growth rate, we need structural reforms, many structural reforms. And this is what you are voting about. Now, what will happen next? 4% of inflation. We chose this target level in order to ensure both economic stability and financial system stability. We understand that healthy economies with more developed financial markets have a lower target inflation, and that's why we will be able to come back to the question of even further lowering the target inflation rate in the near future, like many other countries did that. But currently, it's important for us to reach at least these 4%. This is our inflation expectation. We want to stabilize it, and we want to stabilize our economic development this way. Thank you. Now we have the opinion poll results. Could you please comment, Mr. Kudrin? Okay. Public administration is again among the top priorities in terms of the necessary measures to be taken for transformation, plus monitoring and oversight. I do agree. Yeah, and social sphere. I do agree that these are the two main points that take 50% of your votes, which means that everybody practically agreed that this is the biggest bottleneck in our social system and in our policy. This is what we can start with in terms of reforms, and that's nice to hear that. And the judiciary system, I do agree, is also another priority. I like the results of the poll. It shows that the audience and we sitting here are seeing the things in the same way. Thank you. Let's continue our discussion. And now I would like to ask a question to Maksim Oreshkin. He's a newly appointed Minister of Economic Development. We know that over the past 10 or 15 years, the ministry has been an opponent to the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. What would be your approach in this case, and what criticism can we expect from you? Good morning. Thank you for inviting me for this panel discussion. You are right. Over the past 10 to 15 years, we have a very interesting situation. The same people coming from the central bank to the Ministry of Economic Development or from the Ministry of Finance, moving to Ministry of Economic Development, they started criticizing the position of the institution they worked in before. And I can say that the policy of the Ministry of Economic Development over the past 10 to 15 years has been completely adequate, a completely adequate response to all the shocks and the environment we had to work in. And of course, we focus on resuming the economic development, which we are focusing on now, and of course, keeping low inflation. And it's a question of expectations. It's a matter of businesses being sure that there'll be no catastrophes, no shocks anymore. If you ask somebody in the street, would you expect a two-digit inflation or any major economic turmoils, or if you read the press, there are different opinions and there are some pessimistic ones as well. But the government is working on this actively to change the expectations, and I think this can really produce a very quick effect in terms of favoring economic growth in the country. And we have to also focus on inflation targeting, stabilization of budget system stability, because we need a stable budget system. And I don't see any serious challenges or threats, and I don't believe we will not be able to reach this 4% target inflation rate. Since the crude oil prices have increased this year as well, we have a good opportunity to reduce the expenditures from the National Reserve Fund. Thank you. And the next group of questions is about the budget policy, because all the crises we have had over the past decades, starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was also due to some budgetary turmoils, but not only, plus crisis of 1998, which was a debt crisis plus 2008-2009 crisis of the new millennium, when we started very actively spending what we were accumulating, because we see a 25% increase in expenses. And the shock we had in 2014 when we lost 15% of income in GDP. This also influences the budget system, and Mr. Kudrin was talking about this today as well. He said about possible future loss of crude oil money income in our budget. At the same time, we are expecting economic growth. How does the Ministry of Finance think to respond to such a situation? Should you increase the income, or what are you supposed to do? Thank you for the question. Good morning, dear colleagues. You are right. All the crises before were due to the fact that the economy was diversified, while the budget was very much dependent on the export products prices. And like we discussed in the previous session yesterday, we have had this Dutch disease, and to find a pill for this Dutch disease, you have to understand what you have to do and what the disease is. Now, comparing to 2014, we have much lower oil and gas income in our federal budget. In 2016, the oil and gas income in the budget was 4% lower than before. In 2019, it will be even lower. It would be 0.4% of GDP. And the main shock period, it's over. Thanks God it's over. And what we did, we consolidated both the budget incomes and the budget expenses. And consolidation, budget adaptation to new condition, this isn't only done due to reducing the expenses. We are trying now to attract more income to the budget. We have done this last year, and we are doing this year. And last year we already started collecting more income into our state budget without increasing the tax burden, and we are trying to do it this year. And when we are asked whether we are going to increase further taxes, like 32-33% Mr. Kudrin was talking about, should be quite sufficient to cover the main commitments we have. And in future, we will have to focus on administering the budget. And we have big reserves. We have a big gray sector. We have a lot of opportunities to attract more money to the budget without increasing taxes. And this is exactly what we are doing currently. And the consolidation of expenses is another way to solve the problem. 2/3 of the budget should be expenses, 1/3 should be the income. And social support, for instance, like we said, if we adopt the program and the strategy of transformation of the pension system, which provides for higher pensions to those who needs pension more than the others who do not need that high pensions, and then if we do so, then we'll be able to spend more money on healthcare, for instance, because the retired persons, they need high-quality health services. And maybe even we will add a little, maybe that matters more than a little bit more money added to the pension. So we are planning to implement such a maneuver in the coming years. So the oil and gas income in our state budget, this is over. This period is over. We have gone through this. We know that we have provisions we have reserves in the income part of the budget and to ensure growth. We see opportunities, and in the coming 5 to 7 years, we will implement these transformations. Thank you. Tatyana, a question to you. In your interview to Izvestia newspaper this last autumn, you said that you could find 1 trillion rubles in the budget income. What can you say about this? Good morning, dear colleagues. Inefficient expenses is a result of inefficient public governance, public administration, because if we look for the reasons, for the main causes of these inefficient costs, we will come to understanding that this is due to the inefficient administration. And I will support what Mr. Siluanov said. When we are talking about consolidation of resources, now considering last year and considering the changes we had to accept and introduce, we think that we could consolidate and mobilize not 1 trillion of inefficient resources, but a little bit less, but about 650, 670 billion rubles. Why? Jointly, we had done a lot to reduce a certain part, a certain share of inefficient expenses, but we have not done everything to reduce them. So I think we could be able to mobilize about 120, 150 billion rubles on top of what I was saying. And you understand that the revision of 2016 budget was made late in the year, in December 2015, and that's why we had different income expectations, but the income in our state budget, we got quite a lot. We got even more probably than we expected. Possibly this is due to the fluctuation of the crude oil prices, but not mainly because of this, because only early in 2017 we will see the main impact of the crude oil price change on our budget income. Talking about the amount of money we could reroute to cover other expenses, first of all, I would like to mention such a goal as subsidies or property contribution or contribution to the equity of the existing development institutes. We have about 35 or so institutes in different forms, and over their existence, they were born at different times, and the federal budget spent 4.7 trillion rubles on their development from the state budget, and 250 to 450 billion rubles are spent every year to support them. About 70% of this money is usually spent, and about 30% of the money is not spent by the beginning of the next fiscal year. So the question is, why have you asked for this money for investment if you did not invest it? Because very often this money is not even spent on what it was asked for. There is another important thing I would like to focus on. I'm not talking about private investment. I'm talking about the efficiency of state investments. We are always very cautious when expecting the economy in this respect. In crisis times, in 2014, 15, 16, the state allocated money for investments. And what happens to this money? Quite a big share of this money is not used, and the efficiency of state investments is getting lower and lower, and the state investment, which is considered and is called as federal or regional industry programs, 90.4% of them have been implemented from what was supposed to be done. In 2016, only 73 out of 90-something projects that were supposed to be implemented on the state investment. But this inefficiency of state investment is due to inefficiency of public administration. I don't want to repeat the evident things once and again, but we are not able to take timely decision on land allocation and other things, but we are very timely lobbying the volumes of state resources that we want to be allocated, to be invested here or there. And when the structure of the budget expenses is changing, we have to abandon the old analytical grouping of costs, which is called the federal industry programs. The priorities should favor our economic development via reasonable budget spending. This is what Mr. Kudrin was talking about. And there is another thing Mr. Kudrin mentioned. It's 390 information systems that currently function in our federal authorities, federal executive authorities, because this results in quite a substantial volume of inefficient costs. This actually generates additional costs related to administration systems, because the majority of these information systems mainly mean transformation from the federal executive organ to outsourcing of the functions the federal authority should implement itself. And this is another major source of saving the government's money. And to be fair, we have to say that over the past 2 years, we collaborate very much with the Ministry of Finance in this respect. And I think that we managed to do something in this respect in order to improve a little bit the cost structure. Of course, there's still much to be done to globally improve it, but we still have some good results. And we need to know what expenses should be covered by the state budget. And you have seen the diagrams in Mr. Kudrin's report, considering the share of social policy expenses in the government's budget. The first priority is modernization of systems of social insurance, because without modernization of these systems, it will be very difficult for us to prioritize other things in order to make our budget spending more efficient. Thank you. When we're talking about the sources of economic growth, like Mr. Kudrin was talking about FTP, labor, and capital. But talking about investment, we are talking about the 3 sources of growth. It's not just in growth of capital, growth of labor productivity, improvement of quality of human capital. I'd like to ask the opinion of our colleagues in the audience. I'd like to ask you the following question. What does the inflow of investment into the real economy sector depend on? First of all, number one, on the policy of the central bank, on international environment, on high risks for investors, administrative obstacles, or number 5, ability of Russian companies to effectively use the investment. And while you are voting, let me ask a question to Mr. Oreshkin. 2007 to 2009, the investment was about 20-21% of GDP. Now it's below 18%. What's the problem? Why is it so low? Why do you invest so little money? Your opinion.
You would take a look at the actual investments, which is about 22% right now, which is not really important because truly this is an absolutely correct question about the level of investments which we're currently seeing for higher rates of growth are not enough. And there are no easy solutions to it. To dramatically grow investments in the GDP, it won't happen. And I fully agree with Tatyana, who's saying that the government investments is not truly the best way about growing the overall level of investments. The priority here is an absolute and clear one. It should be coming from private sources. When a private investor makes a decision either to invest or not to invest, he's always looking at two things: the earnings that he's going to enjoy from certain investments and the kind of risk which are associated with these investments. And effectively, many of the points that we see in this particular issue, they can be split into the profitability and risks categories. If you take a look at them within these two things, you've got to be able to move in order to incentivize investment activity. And as far as the profitability is concerned, in the first place, to reduce the kind of costs and the costs which businesses could avoid. And this is also about the natural monopoly tariffs, for example, and the taxation system, which, according to my mind, in the case of the companies which work in the legal part of the economy, are quite high. There are many questions about the business environment, administrative costs and burdens, with the reporting which the business has to submit. And for the Russian economy, there is a very serious issues of costs for intermediary service because the path from manufacturer to consumer is very long. Now, and as far as risks are concerned, something that I've already mentioned previously, at this point in time, the most important thing are macroeconomic risks, the lack of stable expectations in the macroeconomic dynamics in the future, also the question about the certainty and predictability of the taxation system, regulatory system, the competitive environment, as well as the protection of the proprietary rights in the economy. So these are the two areas where one should move forward, and as I used to say, very quick results we can achieve in the first place by providing a greater certainty as far as macroeconomics and the taxation system are concerned, which is something that we need to do as fast as possible within the next 12 months. Of course, at the same time, we shouldn't forget about reducing excessive burdens for the businesses. Then could you also comment, and we already have answers, well, specifically the high risks for investors is the second set, administrative barriers, and the investment efficiency application by companies is very often related to the kind of costs which businesses incur and which are in the way for the businesses to undertake effective investments. So we've got a quiet level of unanimity between the audience and the speakers. I do see it as well. Oh, they haven't projected it. Could you please put up the answers onto the screen? Yes, here. Sorry, that was a technical mishap. Shall we can see it now? Tatyana Alexeyevna, a more specific question to you. You partially answered it. It is quite clear that private investments, something that we're talking about, it won't be compensated for by the government ones, but you yourself underscored that the budget investments in many ways is not efficient. But what are the ways to improve the efficiency in this way, you would quote? Well, you know, I would tell you banal things. You simply have to enact the kind of legislation that we have adopted, because today, unfortunately, something that we see within this first area in terms of simple inefficiency of the application of government investments, this is not compliance with the kind of procedures which are set forth in the regulation. If we would have been very strict in complying with them, I would say that the quality of the planning itself in the budgetary processes for these investments and the quality of their administration and execution would have looked much better. Now, in as far as the second part of it is concerned, and to the second part I attribute the quality of priorities for the selection of investments, and so the quality of priorities for selecting investments, amongst other things, is predefined by the ideology of the fiscal policy which we set forth for the medium and long-term perspective. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, let's say, the very strongly government-dependent sectors such as education and healthcare, They account for, if you deduct the transfer pension funds, so these two sectors account for considerable spending in the extended government budget. But if we take a look at the structure of these spendings, we will see that in 2014, let me say, 73% were the costs to provide services within these sectors, current expenditures, and respectively 27% accounted for certain government spending and investments. But at the same time, we are very well aware that these sectors primarily can get investments only from the government fiscal system to a larger extent, maybe education to a lesser extent, healthcare definitely from the budget based on the structure of investments which we are having globally. Now, what do we get based on the results of 2016? Based on the results of 2016, we end up having a very dramatic growth of current spending and a decline of investment component in both these sectors. You may respond by saying this is well justified because we are raising our wages in compliance with the presidential task, but this is not exactly the case. We are growing our wages, and as a result of it, our current spending is growing, but we are absolutely not paying any heed to the economic structure within the current spending. And if we would have been more demanding in our approach and more strict in our approach to planning for these current spendings, which shape ultimately the cost of a service, I would assure you that this ratio would change, because if we would switch over to what Alexey Kudrin mentioned in his presentation, whereby we need to raise the share within GDP our cost for healthcare, but at the same time we should ask ourselves the question, what kind of healthcare and educational component, and at which periods of times we're supposed to support them, and then we'll be up against the issue of the labor productivity and technological modernization in these sectors, because the tear and wear in healthcare, since long is in excess of 50%. And so if we demand the improvement in labor productivity and the optimization of respective quantities as is common, we won't be able to achieve it as long as technological modernization and the respective professional training in these areas doesn't happen. And you and us, and I already quoted this figure, simply just to stay at the level of redundancies that these two sectors demonstrate, we need to invest as a minimum 200 billion rubles, which is a considerable amount of money for the fiscal season and a considerable amount of money for the sectors. But these sectors also must be ready to accept them, because as a rule, we end up facing the discrepancies in the processes, because when we're ready to invest, these sectors are not ready to accept them and to properly dispose of them. So I believe that we've got to be very precise in the prioritization and time-wise to structure these priorities, not only in these spheres as such, but also inside the line items of spending which define these sectors. Thank you very much. The next set of issues for us to discuss is the financial sector. Quite clearly, this is a necessary condition for a stable and sustainable growth. There are no fast-growing economies which you won't see having well-developed banking system, a reliable insurance companies, investment funds, and another structure of collective investments, non-government pension funds. Ksenia Valentinovna, could you please describe to us the future of the Russian financial system and the challenges that it is facing? Thank you very much. Well, yes, indeed, the role of the financial sector is to create conditions for the citizens and for the businesses to efficiently manage their finances, and that applies to managing current expenditures and to managing investments and savings. And the first thing that I would definitely like to know that we've got certain successes in this area, because the banking sector right now accounts for about 100% of the GDP, and in terms of its assets, this is not so little for the economy of Russia. Recently, we've achieved some good successes in developing financial infrastructure, which is acknowledged to be of a high class by many foreign rating companies, and foreign expert community. We have created the legislative basis and the many of institutions that you are mentioning, the kind of institutions which enable us to accumulate long-term resources and invest them into financial markets. It's a different matter that, of course, the size of the sector is still sufficiently low, but nevertheless, there are many weak spots. The first weak link is sustainability of the financial system, of all of the financial institutions separately considered, because we can see that during the past few years there are so many risks that have manifested themselves, and these risks currently against a very complex external environment started showing themselves up. And so the first thing to do is to improve the stability of the financial system, and that is what the supervisory and regulatory reforms are aimed at. Another task both for these reforms and I would say an educational kind of task is to improve the quality of the risk management in the financial system. The risks have piled up because the financial system has not been very masterful in managing, in assessing and mitigating them, because, you know, this is its direct function. So this is something that one should be very seriously dealing with. Then on, despite the successes in creating conditions and eliminating the barriers for the development of different financial instruments and institutions, the barriers for the developments are still there. So it is necessary to continue working over their elimination and also working over improving the efficiency, the application of new modern technologies within the financial system itself. This is yet another area of application of our efforts, and undoubtedly all around these areas it is important to cooperate with the Russian parliament and the government, because there are certain process and legislative things that the central bank itself is involved in. So there are many issues of legislative work, and so within those you've got to cooperate with the parliament and the government, and so there are many issues related to the financial literacy and education and the competency improvement of the investors themselves, and that applies both to the small and medium-sized businesses and to the major corporates, etc. So the task is indeed to work all around, and the basic task is long-term financial resources and the small business. Basically, the reform that we are proposing right now of the three-tier financial system, its basic task is to provide conditions for the small businesses to be able to better manage its finance, and on that basis to better develop. So the last thing that I wanted to mention, we spoke about inflation in the very beginning, and so specifically these are interrelated things. I mean, the well-developed financial market and the inflation, I mean, low inflation, so that's where you have to move. And Alexey Leonidovich Kudrin in the very beginning said that in 3 years' time we've got to think about lowering the target. We need to understand whether it should be within 3 years or is it a longer range task, because right now the important priority to keep the low inflation at 4% in order to create conditions for the financial market to take off, and various measures for the development of the financial market which would enable the economy to better and more efficiently develop itself. Thank you, Ksenia. The issues that we are discussing have one very important aspect, which is territorial, because we all live and work in a very specific region, in a very specific municipality or district, irrespective of the way the country is organized, whether it's a federal state or unitary state. The system of fiscal federalism is a very important one in order to have the country develop efficiently. In this country, when developing the fiscal federalism system, one should take into account very important peculiarity, which is a very high level of differentiation, both in the development level as well as the income base, both regionally and in municipalities. Anton Germanovich, I've got a question for you. Does the Minister of Finance think whether one should reform the system of fiscal federalism that we currently have? If positive, then in what way? Well, naturally, it is thinking about it all the time, including the fiscal federalism as a system. But I would like to say that the basic decisions and the basic thoughts, they already have been implemented, because there have been a very firm base established in the regional budget, and I would like to say that even during the difficult periods, like during the past 12 months, in particular for 2016, whereas the federal budget income has fallen down by 6%, without taking into account the dividend income from Rosneft, the non-tax ones 8% into the federal budget. It lost compared to the level of 2015. On the contrary, the regions have demonstrated growth. No, I'm telling a lie. The regions have grown by 8%, while the federal budget lost 5%. But the essential idea is that the regions demonstrate a very sustainable basis in order to respond to all of the kind of challenges which may happen in this economy. This is first thing. Second, a sufficiently comprehensive system of inter-budgetary transfers has been developed. Yes, we currently did an inventory of the authorities to spend that have been given to the Russian regions, and we found out there's a whole number of regions, 14 of them, don't have enough sufficient income in order to support the kind of authority that the federal legislature has bestowed upon the regional and municipal levels. This kind of an inventarization we did until 2015. Now, so what one is supposed to do? So it was suggested that next year fine-tuning should be done in terms of the inter-budgetary relations and to utilize the experience in some countries. And in a certain way, we made a decision about a negative transfer. We took some of the profits from the regions in the first place, from those who are strong regions, who are donor regions, and we've passed this money on to those who are needy. And this, I am confident, would enable us to better balance the budgets of the Russian regions in this same year. And by the way, I would also like to quote some figures. During 2016, the overall balance in the regional budgets turned out to be much better, whereas in 2014 the disbalance, I mean, the deficit was about 470-some billion rubles. Last year, it was 171 billion rubles. I mean, the year before the last year, let me say, it was 57 billion rubles. In other words, the regional budget balance is improving, and if we take a look at the debt, something that we've been always observing on the regional side, the debt in terms of the taxation, non-taxation income has gone down by 1 percentage point compared to last year. Now the question is, what are we to do with the authority? Should we pass it on from one level to another? And this is the issue that is always being considered together with the profitable base, because the authority, if we pass it, then consequently also various profits are being passed from one level of the budget system into another. So far, we haven't planned any serious decisions. We're simply saying that there's a need for us to ensure stability of the regional budgets, to reduce the debt burden, and all of the interfiscal, interbudgetary changes which are adopted in the current year, and the changes which are coming, including when preparing our proposals about how the taxation system is to change. They will be aimed at ensuring additional stability for the budgets of the Russian regions. That is exactly the way that the Russian government is going to work. Thank you very much, Anton. And I would like to go back to the problem of the structural reforms and raise a question to Mr. Muller. What are the kind of structural reforms that, from the point of view of your personal point of view and the World Bank experts, do believe to be the top priority? Do you agree with the kind of an assessment that Mr. Kudrin gave us, and in the responses from the audience, that the public administration, the legislation, the supervisory control activity require this immediate reformation, or do you think differently?
Thank you very much. First, let me share that the assessment and the very impressive presentation by Mr. Kudrin makes it very clear that for Russia to be able to be on a higher growth, sustained path will take determined actions across many different areas. And I absolutely fully subscribe to that diagnostic. And I also heard from the panelists that that action is that sense of need for action across various sectors is very much recognized. I'd like also to say that, as the Minister of Finance Siluanov made very clear, that the fiscal adjustment that Russia went through has been very robust, and it has been remarkable. In that sense, Russia has demonstrated an ability. So Russia is now in a much stronger position, and it might be a good time now to also think about putting in place long-term fiscal rules that would enable you to be less dependent over time on oil revenues. And I think there the example of a few countries, such as Chile, for instance, or Norway, could be of interest. In terms of the challenge that Mr. Kudrin highlighted, which is how to improve productivity in the economy, I'd like to I think that is very much at the core of that long-term challenge. And I'd like to share with you three elements, maybe, of how growing productivity could be achieved. The first one is around competition and competitiveness. The Russian economy has, and the Russian government, have improved the business regulatory framework significantly over the last few years. Simplifications of business regulation, and this has been shown in the World Bank report Doing Business, where Russia's ranking has improved steadily. Now, within these improvements, I believe it is still very important to focus on building a more level playing field among firms to help actually private firms, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, contribute to the diversification and the growth of the economy. There is also a couple of areas where Russia's competitiveness and economic performance is undermined, and we'll single out one, which is logistics. When you look at logistics performance rankings or indices, you will see that Russia typically is in the brown. Let's say if there are 160 countries ranked, Russia is still around 90th in the world. And I think this has been recognized, and Russia has a specific challenge due to its territory. But it is very much an area where, if you look at fast-growing economies in the world, they've made very significant progress in those areas over the last few years. The competition also should be considered as trying to build in competition in some of the key sectors. I was thinking there, for instance, in the area of the financial sector, but also transport. And a number of countries have done comprehensive competition reforms, and I would say probably examples that have been particularly successful are Australia and Mexico into that. We also have here, in terms of competition, making sure that the role of the state in some of the productive sector does not impede new companies coming in, or more importantly, companies growing. The second area beside competition I would like to highlight is innovation. I think there has been a few critical words towards government and government services, which I think is always fair game. But I have to say that if you look at innovation and the adoption of technology, Russian citizens and government are actually better at adopting technology than Russian private sector firms. So looking, for instance, at technological innovation, only 10% of Russian firms report technological innovation activity, whereas in OECD countries it is typically around 30 or 40%. And I think Mr. Kudrin in his report emphasized that very much, and I would believe that this is part of these reforms needed going forward to build strength in the economy. The third area, and that was mentioned also a couple of times, is around skills. And there I focus on two areas. One is education and education reforms. Russia, in the last, there's a program for international student assessment, PISA, in which the latest PISA results were released in December. And actually, Russia significantly improved its position and was, for instance, very good around reading and writing. However, in terms of how the performance of students is between low-income and higher-income students, there have been very significant gaps and differences. So I think the focus in education is to really improve the quality across the whole system. The second area in skills is about the link between education and the job market and the labor market. I think there Russia faces a challenge that many successful Russian enterprises will say that they're lacking skilled labor. So there may be a mismatch between what the education system produces and the need of the economy. But I wanted to emphasize, because we heard before about health and healthcare, that one of the main challenges, and Mr. Kudrin made it very clear, is that you will have an aging working population going forward. And it is a challenge. It can be seen maybe as a negative, but we have to transform that into an opportunity and a benefit. And I think there, the key element as a labor force is aging is that you will have continued educations for adult population and an ability to reskill. But reskilling is not enough, because you also need healthy labor force. And I think there, the focus on making sure that that aging population, both working and non-working, that their health improves. And that, I think, is very much an important point, because if you have an aging working population that is unhealthy or in poor health, obviously it's impossible for that population to be highly productive. So I think the prioritization, for instance, of the health programs should be also made with that in mind. So these were the areas I wanted to share with you on structural reforms, but to again emphasize that the comprehensiveness of the diagnostic and the proposals that are made by Mr. Kudrin today, I think, are key to the success. There's no single measure that will enable Russia to be on that higher growth path. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about technological development of the country, which Mr. Kudrin was focusing on a lot in his speech. And experience and economic theory shows that the role of the state is very big one in education and creating environment for innovative development, for technology development. Yet over the past 10 or even more years, a couple of dozens of institutes of development were created. It's Vnesheconombank, a Russian fund of direct investment, Rosnano, fund of restructuring of industry, and many others. But there is no technological breakthrough, though. So my question to Andrei Klepach is the following. What do you think about this? What do we have to do to speed up the technological development? Thank you. Well, that's true. This is a paradox. I agree that technological development is a priority for us, yet every time we see that expenses on R&D, both public and private expenses, are at the same level for about 8 years already. I'm talking about percentage. This year, the funding of Academy of Sciences is 30% lower than it used to be. But if we talk about the development institutes, they were not created for innovations as such and not for favoring technological development. They have different goals. Rostechnology is a joint stock company which was focusing, first of all, on restructuring of enterprises, on saving them. Now, this is true, this is a high technology industry sector, but mainly focusing on defense industry and double technologies, and the expenses on R&D in that particular area are growing. The Russian Fund of Direct Investment, again, it's focusing on high return projects. Vnesheconombank. High technologies have never been a priority for this bank. In the new strategy, technological development is one of their priorities for future, including the projects that will be implemented in the framework of National Technological Initiative, but this is just a plan for some distant future. So it's RVK and Rosnano could be considered as technological development institutes, but again, we expected a high effect, but not exactly where it should have been, because Russian venture company, it works via funds and creates companies which could be sold, but that's not quite the kind of market for this. I wouldn't say this fund is a highly efficient one, but this is just a different model of innovative business. Rosnano, notwithstanding all the criticisms we have heard towards it, this is a company which does implement certain high-tech projects like nanotubes, company project with quite an interesting technology, world-level technology, microchip project Baikal, which is a complex one, but it's supported by Rosnano. And we forget that not all investments in innovative technologies can be strictly assessed. And like Anatoly Chubais said, you should have an option of error, and you have to understand that you should not expect a quick payback of these technologies. 3.5% of GDP, Vnesheconombank Fund of Development of Industry, $300 million. You know, the problem is not just about money, but it's rather about the selection of projects, how the projects are being selected. And we also need to transform the system of governance in these organizations, because they live on their own. And their existence is not always linked to the priorities declared by our country. But state, federal special programs, these are also priorities the government has set. And the main question is how to efficiently coordinate the activities of various stakeholders in solving these problems. When Mr. Kudrin was talking about the problems, he said that the state makes selective decisions. It's always like this, but the question is how correct the decision is. And if the decision is the right one, all the institutions should implement it, not just try to live on their own, which currently happens. We have very high requirements to the activities of various funds and others, like in Golikova and the Russian venture company, you have to bring up to 50% of private funding, but we understand it's not always possible, and there are a number of high-tech projects which initially should be funded via these funds and only later could be sold, for instance, in the market. That's why I think we need to make a really fair analysis of what has already done, and the activities of these institutions should be reformatted. because what they are doing is not only management of property, administration of property, like the Academy of Sciences, for instance, because we forget about different sciences. We have a very big technological potential, but it's difficult to somehow put together all these elements, the budget funds, the development institutes, and the potential we have, because if we manage to combine these elements, then the effect will be much higher than what we currently see. Thank you. My next question goes to Maksim. We're talking about economic growth. But of course, there are certain structural limitations. Which are the main ones? Which should be considered, first of all, when developing the strategy for future? I'd start by the financial system and how the financial system allocates resources to different elements of economy, because we need to understand which areas of economy will receive money, which will not, or less. And this is one of the key questions. And over the past 2 years, the public attention to the central bank was due to the credit policy. Now this is not a top priority because there is no big shock. Inflation is more or less stable. The ruble exchange rate is more or less stable. But the quality of financial system is what we need to focus on. And this will be a priority for the central bank because we need to bring order into our fiscal system so that it works efficiently. And in his speech, Alexey Kudrin was talking about the demographic limitations which exist and which hinder the further development of Russian economy, and that's true. But this year we expect quite a major decline in unemployment rate and a good increase in the salary rate. And I think that this year the salary increase and reduction of unemployment will go further. And what does that mean? New investment projects will sometimes face the problem that the money is available, yet there is little workforce to implement the projects. That's why we need to increase the job offers in the labor market. We need to reduce structural unemployment plus domestic migration in the country. This problem too should be tackled because people should be mobile, should be able to move to the areas or regions where they can find a job. And we also need to improve the qualification of those already involved somewhere. I didn't hear about exports and international cooperation, which is important because if you look at the foreign investment over the past 15 years, all the production facilities that were created in Russia, that were built in Russia, were first of all to satisfy domestic demand. And this was in the times of growing crude oil prices. Currently, we have to understand that even the foreign investors coming to Russia should also focus on export, and Russian companies currently created should also focus on exports so that they could buy, add value and further export their products. And infrastructure is always a priority. I mean, transport infrastructure, export support infrastructure, insurance infrastructure is also important. And you have to understand that this transition from domestic market to global market, this requires a completely different level of certainty, economic predictability if you want major investment projects to be implemented. And what Mr. Kudrin was saying today is about the high costs. He said that a special platform for state services, for public services should be organized, and e-trade, e-commerce should be implemented, I mean implementation of major systems to which a large part of Russian producers will have access in our country, will very much reduce the transaction costs and will favor further development of our economy, and will also favor exports of products produced by SMEs. Because thanks to such e-commerce platforms, foreign consumers, foreign buyers will have access to our resources and supplier base. And another thing is shadow economy, which really distorts a lot our activities, both in the economy, in the banking sector, and it also hinders competition because the quality of management and the ability to control the cost should be the competitive advantages, and not who's going to pay less taxes or find a way to bypass some restrictions. And I think we need to focus on this in the near future, because this could give us a solution to many of problems. I'm talking about the reform of the tax system. We have a good system. It really does work, but we need to fine-tune it. The way that the legal businesses could pay less taxes so that businesses would be able to hire personnel easier with less problems, and so that the corporations could be more involved in innovative development, innovations, implementation, and we are currently preparing proposals on this, and I think that this is what we should focus on. Thank you. And we have about 15 minutes to go. And please answer the questions shorter, but we have very important questions to discuss. And at the end, we'll ask Mr. Kudrin to summarize our discussion. My question goes to Ksenia regarding the banking sector oversight. This mechanism ensures not only the stability of the banking system, but also of the economic system. And now with Elvira Nabiullina's coming to the central bank, we know that this policy changed. The number of banks in Russia was very much reduced due to closing the banks that were not complying with the regulations of the central bank. But what is not clear, what are the future prospects of the central bank? What will be further restrictions of the banking sector? You know, in no country, no central bank has any quantitative targets of how many banks there should exist in the country, because it's a financial market. And that's why the number of financial institutions, the size and whatever of financial institutions existing in the market, this very much depends on the economy, on the financial sector environment, and so on. And the central bank has different regulatory functions and goals. It has to set stability standards. It has to set risk management standards or banking institutes functioning standards and so on. It should regulate the financial institutes functioning in a country on the whole, which would favor further development of economy, which would help manage financial resources, and there should be an efficient oversight system to make sure that the banks are complying with the rules and regulations of the central bank. And this is exactly what we are currently doing, and we really pay a lot of attention to this. Thank you. My next question is a very important one and is quite painful in our country. It's a question about the pensions reform. The general context, as I see it, is as follows. If we don't change anything in our system, the ratio between the average salary to average pension, which is currently 35%, will further decline to 25%. If we want to keep the current replacement rate, we need to either add 1% of GDP into the system or find this money elsewhere or increase the tariffs by 1% or whatever. But all this is about a lot of money. The way out of this problems, as I see it, is increasing the pension age. We will make the system more fair. We will pay pensions to those who are unable to work and not just to all those who are entitled to because of reaching a certain age. You have been working on the pensions reform as well. What's your opinion about the increase of the pensions age? That's a good question. But I'd start with something else. I wouldn't start with increasing the pension age. I would start with modernizing the system of social insurance, because this system is for the working citizens. Currently, in our system, not only the working citizens are covered, but also those who do not work, those who pay much less taxes and charges to the system than the money they receive from the system. And that's why we see this disbalance of the system. And what would be my top priority today, talking about the modernization of social insurance system, I would say it is the number of people for whom the pension system, the system of social insurance is meant, including the system of mandatory medical insurance. And for this, we need to do something, really do something about the labor, undeclared labor. And we are talking about possible 2 years grace period. I don't believe if people do declare that they do work and have an undeclared salary for 2 years, I don't believe it will really work, this measure. So the question is, the system of social insurance, for whom should it be meant? Because without this change, we will not be able to understand what exactly we want to aim at when we say that increasing the retirement age will solve all the problems. Will it really? Of course not. Probably we have now approached a time when the longevity in Russia has increased, the lifespan has increased, that we can finally tackle this problem. But when we are talking about extending the retirement age, we should also speak about adjustment of this in case of loss of ability to work, because we may create unexpectedly a situation, if we do it in the wrong way, that people will start looking for ways to bypass the current principles we are trying to introduce. So we have to see all these factors separately and together. And extending the retirement age, don't forget that the citizens, they are accumulating their rights to pension, and this means that when they retire, we would have to pay them higher pensions than if they had retired earlier. So when modernizing the system of social insurance, we have to answer all the questions. Number one, what commitments do we have to implement, and with respect to which citizens? Number two, what do we do to those participants of the social insurance system who are not making any contributions to it? And if we don't answer these questions together, if we tackle them separately. Sorry, Mr. Kudrin, you in the footnotes wrote that women should retire at 63 and men at 65. We will not just by this single measure solve the problem of restoring balance in the pension system. We have to solve all these problems only together, because the solutions do exist. We just have to discuss them. And I think the society is now ready to discuss all these complex issues. And the main thing depends on how we are going to tackle this, talking to the society. Thank you. Anton, a question to you. As a follow-up regarding the financial system transformation, the borrowing, the public borrowing and private borrowing is done in the same markets. The federal budget or regional budgets, how much can they count on internal borrowing in the near future? For financial resources to be invested in the economy and not just to fund the budget deficit, you have to reduce the budget deficit, right? And for this purpose, we have a 3-year budget prepared, which will reduce this disbalance by 1 percentage point every year. And when somebody says that the Ministry of Finance wants to reduce the budget deficit, that it's our top priority now. Our top priority is to reduce the volume of resources the budget borrows from the financial sector, because then these resources could be used on credits, investments, and could be invested in our economy. And that's the main macroeconomic goal we have to solve to ensure the balance of our budget. So we need to have more efficient investments in private sector and in public sector. And number two, the demand for ruble-denominated financial instruments is very high. Why? Because the return is real good. Of course, we understand that now we have a 3-year budget, macroeconomic policy is there. We decided not to change in the coming future anything of this, plus the ruble's exchange rate, which is stronger. For foreign investors, now investment is really interesting. And don't forget that we also have now additional instruments. So we are introducing like inflation-oriented instruments with return depending on the market borrowing. And this year we are going to implement some new securities, new financial instruments for a general population. Should we increase the range and the volume of these instruments? No, I don't think so. We need to make more attractive public borrowing, but not due to increasing the return, but rather due to creating conditions when investing in government bonds. Even if the return goes down, the investment would be stable and attractive for investors. This means macroeconomic stability, economic stability, and this is one of our main goals we are featuring in our budget. So answering your question, let me say that we are going to continue to extend the range of various instruments and to make them more attractive for the investors on the one hand. And on the other hand, we perfectly realize that we have to create the environment for financial resources in the market to be of more interest, to be invested not in state securities, but in the economy, in real economy. The resources should not sit in bank deposits. The money should be invested in projects where the return would be much higher than the interest on deposits or in state securities. That's the basic goal of our financial policy now. Thank you. Thank you. And I have two very short questions because we are already running out of time. Alexey, could you please comment comment the part of Mr. Kudrin's report regarding development of non-resource-based exports. So what prospects do we have in terms of development of this area? Like a famous joke says, if you measure my length in parrots, I'm longer. So I think that the prospects are real good. In the strategic project, the government has approved on development of exports and coordination of exports. I think they are targeting 8% growth a year. And I think that's doable. If you take the automotive industry exports, they have declined in the past 2 years. So I do see prospects. Probably now we shouldn't make too optimistic plans, hoping that we will very greatly increase the export because the export of automobiles or rail cars or other things. I think there may be more interesting exports, more promising, because I think we have good capacities and opportunities in chemical industry, polyethylene, polypropylene export. We can export raw materials, but higher conversion grade raw materials like in timber industry and paper and pulp industry. Rolled metal, pipes. We have also production facilities set up abroad. So look at what our businesses have done. They have invested, for instance, in pipe mills in other countries quite seriously. So why not? This is also important, very important for the Russian business. And this is a good prospect for Russian business. But the second priority is support. The state is now starting to allocate good support to these businesses, and I think we should continue that, and that would require more state guarantees and more lending opportunities. Now it's only $1 billion or so, which is nothing globally, and we are not competitive in the majority of cases in terms of financial terms of export. Support. That's why we need additional resources like in other countries like China and others have. Thank you. And last question to Mr. Muller. I know it's difficult to answer it in 1 minute, but still, let's try. Based on your personal experience, on the World Bank experience, which country's experience would be useful for Russia to follow in terms of enhancing technological development?
Difficult question to answer, even in 10 minutes. I think what Russia should aim is to take from different countries what has worked best. And I think there are examples, for instance, in innovation or in digital technology, that some countries, such as Canada, maybe Australia also, have developed national digital strategies that enable really the economy to invest and grow into new sectors, especially the digital economy. I think the second part is you have to also look at different examples, because one, you need a strategy. Second, you do need also an infrastructure, a set of platforms that are needed. And there, I think, in Asia, you have some very good examples. But I would like to say that I would hope Russia will not follow a single or even multiple countries, because you do have in Russia some very strong, some strengths that are very important. And I think, for instance, the highly educated population and the strength that we were discussing before in research may mean that if you find a way in Russia to help the dissemination of new technology, to help the development of services, and have a bit more of an openness approach to that, then that could actually be Russia becoming a model rather than following other countries. Thank you.
Now, thank you very much. We wanted to ask the audience the last sociological question, which will be commented by Alexey Kudrin after his final word. So the question is this. What is the main condition to be able to transit to the new model of economic growth? The first one, active actions of the president and the government. The second, continued low oil prices. Continued, remember, rather than growing. Then readiness for change on the part of each of us. Alexey, you're the last speaker. Please comment on this. I mean, in terms of whatever the colleagues said beforehand and the audience. Thank you. Very, very briefly, because I believe the lunch break is coming soon. Dear colleagues, first thing I enjoyed that the room here was voting together with those of us who are on the panel and does share a lot of ideas in the first place about the public administration. This is the most complex knot in all the reforms. It is very politically sensitive, structurally. Inside of it, you see a juncture of many interests, lobbyists, industrial groups, various groups in the executive bodies and law enforcement. This is the most fine part of it, because I was more referring to the technological story about the opportunities that we can hurdle. But I believe this is very difficult. But nevertheless, I also think that the plan for reforms in this area should be more specific, and various institutions should be reformed. Thank you for your support. The supervisory regulatory support and supervision should be reformed, because to a certain extent it is a hurdle which is really curbing our development. And I would like to draw your particular attention to the fact that you voted about the investment risks in the country. If we do a lot of good things, just, separate from each other, here, there, and someplace else, without the general credibility on the part of investors, believing that the risks are going down, that they would enjoy support, appropriate and justifiable support in the judicial system or the government institutions, respectively, these investments won't start happening. Trust and credibility should be developed through a number of institutions, instruments, and formats, and communications with the society, the feedback from the society, feedback to investors, continued the conversation and dialogue, and various corrections that the government should do about its decisions. So trust is to be developed. This is a very complex system and machine. So due attention should be paid to it, so that investors could see that whatever is being done in a common effort with them. There are certain other things which Maksim Oreshkin described, and Mr. Siluanov and Mr. Muller Cyril also spoke about the infrastructure, which is the most important part, which I really paid little attention to. I would only mention one thing, the kind of tasks that such areas as healthcare and education do call for. Not only this requires just 1% of GDP increase, 2 to 3% within the foreseeable future, because we need to develop infrastructure right now twice as much as a minimum, but rather 3 times as much. I mean, I approximately know the scale and the overall tasks. So in terms of the reconsolidation of the budget in the next 6 years, how are we to find these resources within the fiscal system? Only at the expense of the shadow sector, we won't be able to really materialize it. So we need to really have a very serious conversation. Maybe there should be some market borrowings for the infrastructural project, but then certain risks within these projects will have to be mitigated again, because right now money is not flowing there. So overly too big are the risks there. So, but nevertheless, we need to identify the solution. Fiscal, government, public, private. Here, this kind of cooperation should evolve. And let me finish, because it seems to me that very interesting ideas have been broached by each panelist. Alexey, could you please comment and show us the results of this very last voting? Here they are. Well, the first thing, it's very positive that those present here are ready for change. I mean, to say that we've got the government officials here and the leading experts in the country, as well as the politicians here. I see that the parliamentarians and the members of the upper house are also present here, as well as the businessmen. So first of all, it means that the public is ready for change. So let's talk about them. Let's focus our attention on them and undertake concerted action. Everybody understands whatever is dependent upon the president and the government. We also need to work both with the government and the president. Dear colleagues, great many thanks to all the participants and all those who voted and who stayed with us for these 2 hours. Thanks very much.